right, let's dive in today, shall we? We're looking at this interview with Ryan McBeth. He's a military expert, and he was on the Broe podcast.
Oh, yeah?
You know that one? It's on YouTube. And they talk about, well, a lot, but mainly the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And kind of the global power dynamics, how all that stuff is connected.
Right.
But then this is what I thought was so interesting, they get into these alternate histories,
Oh, like what if scenarios.
Yeah, exactly. And McBeth, I got to say, he really knows his stuff,
Yeah.
He doesn't just talk about, like, what's happening right now, but, like, the bigger picture, like the historical stuff and political.
I think that's what makes his analysis so interesting. He's able to connect what's happening on the ground in Ukraine to, like, the broader global contect. Like, how does this fit into history? How does it affect the world economy?
Yeah, totally. It's like he peels back the layers of the onion or something. You get a much deeper understanding of the whole thing. We'll be talking about, what's motivating everyone involved, how the war is actually going, and there are some potential consequences that I don't think people are really thinking about.
Right. It's like those ripple effects, how this war, even though it's, way over there, how it affects everyone.
Absolutely. So one thing that really jumped out at me, okay, McBeth talks about how Ukraine's hitting these Russian oil refineries, and he calls it targeting the fuel of war.
Ooh, I like that. That's a powerful image.
Isn't it? And he even links this strategy. I thought this was interesting. He links it to, like, maybe a political shift.
What do you mean?
Well, okay, so remember how, like, at the beginning it was Biden,
right,
and then Trump came back?
Yeah.
And he's saying, like, maybe that emboldened Ukraine,
Yeah.
You made them more aggressive, or maybe they just felt like they could be,
Oh, that's an interesting point because, yeah, different administrations, different foreign policy priorities.
Exactly. And McBeth really emphasizes this. He says that Ukraine's resources, they're limited.
Right. They can't just, keep attacking forever.
So every single strike, they got to make it count.
Oh, for sure. And it seems like these strikes on the oil refineries, they are having an impact.
Yeah. Like, you can see it, right? It's putting a strain on Russia's military, and, like, their whole economy is feeling it.
Yeah, and McBeth points to the fact that Russia's central bank rate, it's like 21%.
21%?
Yeah, it's crazy high. And he even said that, like, basic things like butter has doubled in price.
Wow.
So that's hitting people where it hurts,
Yeah.
Wallets. I mean, imagine going to the store and suddenly everything costs twice as much.
That's wild.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, like, how long can Russia keep this up, especially with inflation going through the roof?
Right, exactly. And then, this is another big thing. McBeth argues that maybe Russia's military, maybe is not as strong as, we thought it was.
Really?
Yeah. Like, there's more and more evidence that their capabilities, they're declining.
I'd be curious to hear more about that.
Well, he uses these great descriptions, okay? He talks about how some of their equipment, it's like something out of Mad Max, all cobbled together. And he even says some of it looks like clown cars.
Clown cars!
Yeah, that's what he said. Like, I guess, not very intimidating,
Wow, that's a pretty stark image. It makes them sound, I don't know, almost desperate.
Oh, and it gets, like, worse. He talks about these things called crutch battalions.
What? Yet?
So these are groups of soldiers that they get sent back to the front lines, even though their injuries haven't healed.
Oh, wow. That's rough.
Yeah, isn't it?
It sounds like they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel, Like they're running out of manpower?
And that's what McBeth says. He says they're probably terrified to, like, mobilize the elites. Like the people from Moscow and St. Petersburg. They don't want to cause unrest there.
That makes sense. They want to avoid rocking the boat too much at home.
Exactly. So that means they got to send these guys from, other regions, even if they're not, like, fully ready.
Right. So that raises an interesting question. If things are so bad, like, the equipment's falling apart, they're sending injured soldiers back to the front, why are people still signing up?
That's a good question. What do you think? I mean, what would motivate someone to, go fight in those conditions?
Well, I guess it depends on the individual, right? Maybe some are true believers in the cause. Maybe others are just desperate for, I don't know, a job or a sense of purpose.
Yeah, it's complicated.
For sure. And then there's this whole other layer to consider. Trump's back in the White House, and that could change everything.
Oh, definitely. I mean, McBeth brings up something. I didn't even think about it, okay? He talks about Trump's interest in Ukraine's resources, like their natural resources.
Oh, right. Like what?
Well, they have lithium, titanium, gallium, all that stuff. And McBeth, He calls Trump a deal maker, you know?
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's saying, like, maybe there's going to be some quid pro quo, right? Like, we'll give you military aid, but we get access to your resources.
Oh, so he's suggesting that, like, maybe the U.S. isn't purely motivated by, altruism or wanting to protect democracy.
It makes you think, right? Like, what are the priorities here?
Yeah, it does raise some ethical questions, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And McBeth doesn't stop there. He even talks about, like, maybe Ukraine joining NATO, you know?
Oh, that's a big one. And I know Trump's not a huge fan of NATO.
Right. But McBeth says that, like, for Ukraine to rebuild, for them to be strong, like, long-term, they need American investment.
That makes sense. They're going to need a lot of help to recover from this war, that's for sure.
Okay, so this is where things get really interesting. Okay, so McBeth talks about, Elon Musk
Yeah.
and how he was involved in dismantling USAID.
USAID, like the foreign aid organization?
Yeah. And at first it was like, okay, we're just going to freeze it for a bit, temporary.
Okay.
But then it got, like, way more intense.
Yeah.
Like they really start taking it apart.
Wow, that's a pretty big deal. I mean, USAID does a lot of important work around the world.
And McBeth points out how this, like, really disrupted things, especially for foreign service officers who were, like, in active war zones.
Oh, wow. So they were cut off from support.
Yeah, like all of a sudden they didn't have the resources they needed. It was a mess. Imagine being in that situation. It must have been so stressful and dangerous.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. They rely on those support systems, especially in a war zone.
Totally. And McBeth, he's not so sure this whole, like, dismantling USAID thing. He's not sure it's going to work out. He thinks maybe Musk has bitten off more than he can chew.
That's a good point. It makes you wonder about the limits of executive power, Can you just come in and dismantle a whole government agency?
And he thinks there might be, like, legal challenges down the road.
Yeah, I could see that happening. This whole thing with USI also raises some interesting questions about, like, how efficient is government and how do you actually make changes within these massive systems? It's not easy, that's for sure.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
McBeth tells this funny story about, the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles.
Yeah.
He lived in different states, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about how, like, in one state, it was total nightmare.
Oh, yeah, the DMV is infamous for that.
But then in another state, it was, like, super efficient. So he's saying it's a reminder that bureaucracy, it's a real thing,
Yeah, and even if you want to make things better, it's not always that simple.
So speaking of unpredictable moves, McBeth then talks about, Trump and his whole approach to trade.
Oh, boy. That's a whole other can of worms.
Remember when he put those tariffs on Mexico and Canada?
Yeah. And then he backed down later, like, without really getting anything in return.
Yeah, exactly. Remember the backlash.
Oh, yeah, it was intense. He got booed at that Raptors game.
Yeah. And even Republican senators were like, hey, what are you doing? This is hurting American farmers.
Right. It seemed like everyone was trying to figure out what his game plan was.
Yeah. And McBeth has this theory, he calls it a volume of fire tactic.
Volume of fire? What does that mean?
He's basically saying that Trump, he might be doing all these, like, seemingly random things to create distractions.
Like a smokescreen.
Exactly. So while everyone's focused on that, he can, like, do other stuff behind the scenes.
That's an interesting theory. But, Trump has always been really into, protectionist policies. So maybe the tariffs weren't so random after all. Maybe it was just him sticking to his, his beliefs.
Yeah, that's true. What do you think? Do you buy the volume of fire theory, or do you think there was something else going on?
I don't know. It's hard to say. It's like trying to read his mind. What do you think? What was Trump really after?
It's a good question. Okay, get ready for this one. McBeth then brings up the suggestion that Trump made that the U.S. should, like, take control of Gaza.
Whoa. Wait, what?
Yeah, and relocate the whole population.
The entire population of Gaza. But that's like, what, over 1 million people?
Yeah, something like 1.5 million.
That's insane. And where would they even go?
I know, right?
And think about the optics of that. I mean, wouldn't that be seen as ethnic cleansing?
Definitely a lot of controversy there.
For sure. So how does McBeth explain this?
Well, he looks at it through the lens of Trump being, a real estate guy.
Oh, right.
And he's saying, like, maybe Trump just sees Gaza as, prime real estate, like beachfront property.
So he's saying Trump is looking at it from a purely, like, business perspective.
Yeah, kind of. And McBeth actually says that, like, if Gaza was developed differently, it could be like a paradise,
I guess I can see that. It's got a beautiful coastline.
Yeah. But still, relocating 1.5 million people, that's a huge undertaking.
It is. And I don't know which countries would be willing to accept that many refugees.
Right. It's not like there's a line of countries saying, hey, send them over here.
Exactly. It doesn't seem very realistic.
Okay, so do you think McBeth's volume of fire theory, could it apply here too? Like maybe the whole Gaza thing, was it just a distraction?
It's possible, right? McBeth seems to suggest that with Trump, you always got to be thinking, like, what's the underlying motive? What's he really trying to accomplish?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, so what else does McBeth talk about?
Well, he shifts gears a little bit. He starts talking about, China.
Oh, yeah, China. Everyone's talking about China these days.
And he says, like, we got to be ready because they might invade Taiwan.
Invade Taiwan. Wow. When does he think this could happen?
He says, like, maybe as early as 2027 or 2028.
That soon.
Yeah. And he has some good reasons for thinking that. Okay, so first of all, China has said publicly that their military will be ready for that kind of operation by then.
Okay, so they've basically set a deadline for themselves.
Right, right. And then he points out that 2028, that's an election year in the U.S.,
Oh, so he's saying that they might see that as a window of opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. Like, maybe they think the U.S. will be more focused on, domestic politics and stuff.
And maybe less likely to intervene.
Exactly. And get this, he talks about how China is building these special things called jack barges.
Jack barges, what are those?
They're basically like designed for an amphibious assault, They're made to land on rocky shores like the kind Taiwan has.
Oh, wow. So they're really preparing for this.
Yeah, they're not messing around.
It's a little scary, honestly. But isn't Taiwan, like, really hard to invade? I mean, their geography is pretty challenging, right?
That's what I thought, too. And McBeth says that, yeah, it's similar to Afghanistan and Vietnam, in terms of the challenges for an invading force.
Right, lots of mountains and jungles and stuff.
Yeah. But he also says that despite all that, Taiwan is still vulnerable.
Yeah. I guess it's hard to defend an island, no matter how difficult the terrain.
Right. Okay, here's where things get even more interesting, all right. McBeth says that China might actually betray Russia.
Betray Russia? Wow. Why would they do that? I thought they were, like, allies.
Well, he says that China, they're all about their own self-interest.
Right.
So if Russia keeps, struggling, keeps getting weaker, maybe China decides it's not worth it to stick with them anymore.
So he's saying, like, they don't really have true allies, just, like, friends of convenience.
Yeah, kind of like whoever's useful at the moment, that's who they'll side with.
Wow. That's kind of cold,
It is. And if they do betray Russia, oh man, the consequences could be huge.
Like what?
Well, think about it. If Russia's already weak and then they get betrayed, who knows what they might do? Maybe they launch a nuke, just out of desperation.
Oh, that's terrifying.
It is. And McBeth talks about how North Korea plays into all of this too. He calls North Korea a buffer state.
What does that mean?
It means they're kind of like stuck between these bigger powers,
Okay.
And he says that North Korea, they totally depend on China for, like, everything.
So they have to do what China says.
Pretty much, yeah. So it's like this big, complicated web, all these different countries and their interests and their alliances, all kind of shifting and changing.
It's like a high-stakes chess game with nuclear weapons involved.
Exactly. And McBeth is great at, like, explaining how all the pieces fit together.
Yeah. He really paints a vivid picture of the global landscape.
Okay, so we've talked about war, we've talked about economics, we've talked about, potential nuclear annihilation.
Microscopics.
Right. But now McBeth takes us in a completely different direction. He starts talking about alternate history and specifically his own novel.
Oh, I didn't know he was a writer.
Yeah. He's got a few books, actually. But the one he focuses on here is called The Wind Machine.
The Wind Machine? What's that about?
So it's about this hedge fund manager, right? And he has access to this AI that can predict the future.
Whoa, an AI that can predict the future? That sounds pretty cool.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And the AI predicts that there's going to be a war with China. So this guy, he's got this dilemma, right? Does he tell the government? Or does he, use this information to make a ton of money?
Oh, that's a tough one. Like, what's the right thing to do? Profit or patriotism?
Exactly. And McBeth, he explores those questions in the book. Like, what would you do in that situation?
Sounds fascinating. I'm going to have to check that out.
You should. He also mentioned some other writing projects he's working on.
Like what?
Well, he's got one that's about the search for bin Laden. And then this one I thought was really interesting. He's writing an alternate history of Utah.
Alternate history of Utah. What does that even mean?
So in his book, Utah is like An independent theocracy.
A theocracy, so like ruled by religious leaders.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
led by the LDS Church.
Wow, that's a pretty bold concept. I wonder how that would have changed things, you know? Not just for Utah, but for the whole country.
I know, right? It really makes you think about, like, the power of religion and how it shapes societies.
Definitely. It's like a whole different version of America.
And he tells this great story about, get this, a piano.
A piano.
Yeah, yeah. Apparently, the Mormon pioneers, they, like, slowly moved this piano all the way to Salt Lake City.
Wow, that must have been a journey.
I know, right? It took them forever. But he uses that story to talk about, like, the resilience of those early settlers, you
Yeah.
know, their dedication to building this new life for themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like even in the face of incredible hardship, they still found ways to hold on to beauty and culture.
Exactly. It's just this little detail, but it says so much about the bigger picture, you know?
Absolutely. It's those little details that often reveal the most about a culture.
Okay, so I know we've covered a lot of ground here, from war in Ukraine to, like, the future of global power, and then, you know, piano-moving pioneers in Utah.
Quite a range of topics.
I know, right? But McBeth, he somehow ties it all together, and he raises so many important questions.
He does. He really gets you thinking.
And for me, one of the most, like, striking things he talks about is the crutch battalions.
Yeah, that was pretty disturbing.
It really brings home the human cost of this war, you know?
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture stuff, but ultimately it's individuals who are suffering.
Exactly.
Mm.
And then Trump's interest in Ukraine's resources, I didn't even think about that.
Me neither. It's a reminder that international relations can be pretty cynical sometimes.
Right. It's not always about, like, doing the right thing. There's a lot of self-interest involved.
For sure. And then there's the whole USAID situation. I mean, that could have major consequences. We're still seeing how that plays out.
Yeah, and it raises some questions about, like, what's the role of government? And what about private individuals getting involved in those systems?
Definitely a lot of gray areas there.
Okay. And, of course, we can't forget about McBeth's take on Gaza. I mean, that was definitely one of the most, like, thought-provoking parts of the interview.
Yeah, it was pretty radical, to say the least.
It was. But it's important to, like, consider these different perspectives, even if we don't agree with them. You know?
Absolutely. It challenges our assumptions and forces us to think critically.
Right. And then McBeth's insights into China, that was eye-opening too. Like, the idea that they might betray Russia, that just shows how quickly things can change on the global stage.
Yeah, and how unpredictable things are.
Okay, so we're out of time for this part of our deep dive, but we'll be back soon to explore these topics even further.
It really shows how important these support systems are, you know? Especially when you're talking about, like, life or death situations.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And you know what? This whole thing with USAID, it kind of makes you think about the bigger picture too, right?
What do you mean?
Well, like, how much power does the president actually have? You know, can they just come in and dismantle a whole agency like that?
Right. And could there be, like, legal consequences down the road? It's definitely a tricky situation.
Totally.
Mm.
And then, thinking about USAID, it makes me think about, like, government in general. You know, like, how do you actually make these big systems work better?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Bureaucracy, it's a beast.
McBeth actually tells this story about, you know, the DMV
Mm.
gonna get your driver's license.
Oh, yeah, everyone's got a DMV story.
Right. And he was talking about how in one state, it was like the worst experience ever, you know, just total chaos.
I can relate to that.
But then you live in another state and it was like super efficient, you know, everything ran smoothly,
Wow, so it is possible to have a good DMV experience.
apparently. But he was using that to say, like, even when people want to improve things, those systems, they're hard to change.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so speaking of, you know, things that are hard to predict, McBeth then talks about Trump's whole trade war thing.
Oh, boy. Yeah, that was a wild ride.
Remember when he put tariffs on Mexico and Canada?
Oh, I remember, yeah. It was all over the news. And everyone was freaking out, like, what's he doing?
And then he just kind of backed down, you know, like without really getting anything out of it.
Yeah, I never really understood what that was all about.
And remember, like, the backlash. I mean, he got booed at a basketball game, the Raptors game.
Yeah, and even some Republicans were like, hey, this is hurting American businesses.
This is a mess.
Totally. So what does McBeth make of all that?
Well, he has this theory. It's called the volume of fire tactic. Okay.
Volume of fire.
Yeah, it's like he's saying that maybe Trump was doing all this crazy stuff on purpose, you know, to distract everyone.
So while we're all focused on the trade war, he's doing something else behind the scenes.
Exactly. Like a magician, you know. Look over here while I do this over there.
That's an interesting theory. But Trump has always been a big supporter of tariffs, right? So maybe it wasn't a distraction. Maybe he really believed in it.
Yeah, that's true. He did campaign on it, bringing back jobs and all that.
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure. What do you think? Do you buy the volume of fire theory?
I don't know. It's definitely possible. What do you think Trump was trying to achieve?
Honestly, I have no idea. It's like
Yeah.
trying to figure out a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Yeah, he's definitely a tough one to figure out.
Okay, so what else does McBeth talk about?
Okay, so brace yourself for this one. McBeth then talks about this idea that Trump had, that the U.S. should, take over Gaza.
A takeover Gaza.
Yeah, and relocate the entire population, all 1.5 million people.
1.5 million people. Where would they even go?
Exactly. I mean, who would take them? And think about the logistics of that. It's just mind-boggling.
It's a crazy idea, and wouldn't that be seen as, ethnic cleansing?
Yeah, there's definitely that aspect to consider. It's a really controversial suggestion, to say the least.
So how does McBeth make sense of this? Why would Trump even suggest such a thing?
Well, he looks at it from the perspective of Trump, being a real estate developer.
So maybe he's seeing Gaza as, beachfront property.
Yeah.
Prime real estate just waiting to be developed.
Yeah, kind of like that. McBeth says that Trump might be thinking, if it wasn't for all the conflict, Gaza could be a paradise,
I guess I can see that. It's got a beautiful coastline. It could be a tourist destination.
Right. But still, relocating 1.5 million people, it's a massive undertaking.
It is. It would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to pull off.
So I'm wondering, do you think maybe this whole Gaza thing, could it be another example of McBeth's volume of fire theory?
You mean maybe Trump was just throwing this idea out there to distract from something else?
Yeah, exactly. Get everyone talking about this crazy idea, and then who knows what he's doing behind the scenes.
It's possible, right? McBeth seems to suggest that with Trump, you can never rule anything out. There's always a chance he's got some hidden motive.
Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, McBeth then starts talking about China and the possibility that they might invade Taiwan.
Oh yeah, China and Taiwan. That's a situation everyone's watching very closely.
Right. And McBeth says, we need to be prepared for this because it could happen sooner than we think.
Really? How soon are we talking?
He says maybe as early as 2027 or 2028.
Wow, that's only a few years away.
I know, right? And he lays out some pretty compelling reasons for why those years are so significant. So first of all, he says China has publicly stated that they want their military to be ready for this kind of operation by that time.
Okay, so they basically set a deadline for themselves.
Exactly. And then he points out that 2028, that's a U.S. election year,
So he's thinking they might try to take advantage of the fact that the U.S. will be distracted with its own internal politics.
Exactly. They might see it as a window of opportunity to make a move without too much interference from the U.S.
That makes sense strategically.
And then, get this, he talks about how China is building these specialized ships called jack barges.
Jack barges. I've never heard of those.
Yeah, so basically they're designed for amphibious assaults, which means they're made to land troops and equipment on a hostile shore.
Oh, so he's saying they're specifically building these ships to invade Taiwan.
That's what it sounds like, yeah.
Yeah.
And apparently, they're designed to deal with rocky shorelines, which is exactly what Taiwan has.
So they're really putting a lot of thought and effort into this. It sounds like they're serious.
Oh, definitely. They're not just, casually thinking about it. They're actively preparing.
It's a little unnerving, to be honest. But isn't Taiwan, pretty hard to invade? I mean, didn't we talk about how their geography is similar to Afghanistan and Vietnam?
Yeah, that's true. McBeth does acknowledge that Taiwan is not an easy target. He says it would be a very challenging operation for any invading force.
Lots of mountains, dense forests. It's not exactly ideal for, tanks and stuff.
Exactly. But he also says that Taiwan is still vulnerable.
I guess even with challenging terrain, defending an island is tough. There's only so much coastline you can protect.
Okay, so this is where things get really interesting, all right? McBeth starts talking about the possibility that China might betray Russia.
Betray Russia? Wow! I thought they were, on the same side.
Yeah, they've been presenting themselves as allies,
Yeah.
standing up to the West together and all that.
Right, right.
But McBeth says that China is ultimately looking out for its own interests, and that those interests don't always align with Russia's.
So he's saying that their alliance might not be as strong as it appears.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it's more of a marriage of convenience, They're together because it's beneficial for both of them right now, but if that changes, all bets are off.
That's a pretty cynical view of international relations, but I guess it's probably realistic.
Right. It's like There are no real friends, just strategic partnerships.
And if China did betray Russia, I mean, what would that even look like? What would the consequences be?
Well, McBeth says it could get really messy. Like, imagine Russia is already weakened by the war in Ukraine, and then their supposed ally turns on them. That could push them over the edge.
Yeah, they might feel like they have nothing left to lose.
Exactly. And McBeth even raises the possibility of a nuclear strike, like a last-ditch effort by Russia to inflict as much damage as possible.
Oh, wow, that's a terrifying thought.
It is. And then he brings North Korea into the equation, too. He says that North Korea is basically a buffer state, stuck between these bigger powers.
What's a buffer state?
It's like a small country that's caught between two larger, more powerful countries.
Oh, okay, so North Korea is kind of stuck in the middle of this whole China-Russia situation.
Yeah, exactly. And McBeth says that North Korea is completely dependent on China for, like, everything. Their economy, their security, everything.
So they have to do whatever China says.
Pretty much, yeah. They don't really have a choice. So it's like this really delicate balance of power. You know, with all these different countries and their interests and their allegiances, it's constantly shifting and changing.
It's like one of those mobile things you hang over a baby's crib, but instead of cute animals, it's nuclear-armed nations.
Exactly. And McBeth does a great job of, like, explaining how all these pieces fit together. It's really complex, but he makes it understandable.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. War, economics, potential nuclear war, complicated alliances, and is there anything else?
Well, McBeth then takes us in a completely different direction. He starts talking about alternate history, which I thought was really interesting.
Alternate history, like what if this happened or what if that happened?
Yeah, exactly. And he even talks about his own novel, which is an example of alternate history.
Well, I didn't realize he was a writer. What's his book about?
It's called The Wind Machine.
Yeah.
And it's about this hedge fund manager who gets access to an AI that can predict the future.
An AI that can predict the future. That sounds pretty cool.
I know, right? And the AI predicts that there's going to be a war with China.
Whoa, that's a big prediction.
Yeah. So this hedge fund manager, he's got a dilemma now, right? Does he warn the government? Or does he use this information to make a ton of money?
That's a tough choice. Profit versus patriotism, huh?
Exactly. And McBeth explores those themes in the book, like what would you do in that situation? What's the right thing to do?
Sounds like a really thought-provoking read.
Oh, it is.
Mhm.
And he mentioned some other books he's working on, too. One is about the search for bin Laden.
Interesting.
And then this one I thought was particularly interesting. He's writing an alternate history of Utah.
An alternate history of Utah. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's so different about Utah in this alternate history?
Well, in his book, Utah is an independent theocracy led by the LDS Church.
Whoa, a theocracy. So, like, ruled by religious leaders.
Yeah, exactly. It's a pretty bold concept, right?
It is. I wonder how that would have changed things, not just for Utah, but for the whole U.S.
I know, right? Like, would the U.S. even exist in the same way? It's really fascinating to
That's
think of
like
that.
a whole different version of America.
And McBeth even shares this little detail about a piano. It's kind of random, but it's stuck with me.
A piano? What about a piano?
Well, he was talking about the Mormon pioneers and how they, like, slowly moved this piano all the way to Salt Lake City.
Wow, that must have been a long and difficult journey.
I know, right? It took them forever. But he uses that story to talk about, like, the resilience of those pioneers, you know, their dedication to building this new life for themselves, even when it meant hauling a piano across the country.
Yeah, that's a great image. It's like they were determined to bring beauty and culture with them, even in the face of all the hardship they face.
Exactly. It's just this little detail, but it says so much about the bigger picture, you know?
Absolutely. It's often those small details that reveal the most about a culture or a historical moment.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from war in Ukraine to, like, a future of global power, and then, you know, piano-moving pioneers in Utah.
It's quite a range of topics, but somehow McBeth manages to connect it all.
I know, right? He's really good at seeing those connections and helping us understand the bigger picture.
Definitely. And he raises so many important questions along the way. It's not like he's giving us all the answers, but he's definitely getting us thinking.
And for me, one of the most, like, striking things he talks about is the crutch battalions.
Yeah, that was pretty disturbing. It's a reminder that behind all the politics and the strategy, there are real people whose lives are being shattered by this war.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder about the moral cost of war, you know? What are we willing to sacrifice in the name of victory?
Heavy stuff. It's definitely something to think about.
And then there's Trump's interest in Ukraine's natural resources. I never even considered that angle before.
Me neither. It's a reminder that international relations are often driven by, like, cold, hard self-interest, not just ideals and principles.
Right. And sometimes those interests clash in ways that can be really damaging.
For sure. And then there's the whole U.S. side situation that's still unfolding, and it's got the potential to have a big impact, both in the U.S. and around the world.
Yeah. It raises questions about, like, what's the best way to provide aid? And what role should private individuals play in these government programs?
And how much power should one person, like Elon Musk, be able to wield?
Right. Big questions there.
And of course, we can't forget McBeth's take on the Gaza situation. That was definitely one of the most, like, controversial and thought-provoking moments of the interview.
Yeah, it was a real head-scratcher. Like,
Yeah.
what was he even thinking? But I do appreciate that he's willing to, like, push the boundaries and challenge our assumptions.
Absolutely. And whether we agree with him or not, it's good to hear these different perspectives. It forces us to think critically and examine our own beliefs.
Okay, so I think we've covered pretty much everything. What are your final thoughts on McBeth's interview?
Well, I have to say he's a really engaging speaker. He's got this way of connecting all these seemingly disparate ideas, and it's really fascinating to listen to him talk. He's definitely got me thinking about all sorts of things.
Yeah, me too. He's like a master storyteller, but he's also like really insightful about the world.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that he's not afraid to tackle tough topics, He's not shying away from the complexities of the situation.
Right. He's not just giving us easy answers.
Uh-huh.
He's making us work for it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good thing. It's too easy to just, like, passively consume information these days. But McBeth's interview, it challenges us to engage with these issues on a deeper level.
Absolutely. So what do you think are the biggest takeaways from this deep dive? Like, what should our listeners be thinking about as they go about their day?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that the world is incredibly complex and interconnected. And what happens in one place can have ripple effects that are felt all over the globe.
Yeah, that's for sure. We're all part of this global system, whether we realize it or not.
And I think another important takeaway is that we need to be open to different perspectives.
Yeah.
We need to be willing to listen to people who have different ideas than our own, even if we disagree with them.
Absolutely. That's how we learn and grow, right?
There you
By
go.
challenging our own assumptions and being open to new ideas.
Exactly. And I think McBeth's interview is a great example of that. He's presenting a lot of different perspectives, and it's up to us to, like, sift through them and figure out what we believe.
Right. It's not about blindly accepting everything he says. It's about using his analysis as a starting point for our own critical thinking.
And I think another important takeaway is that we need to be aware of the potential consequences of our actions. Like, even seemingly small decisions can have huge ripple effects, especially when you're talking about global politics.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, we need to think about the long-term implications of what we're doing, not just the immediate consequences.
And I think finally we need to remember that the future is not predetermined. It's something that we're actively shaping with our choices and our actions.
Yeah, that's empowering, isn't it? It means we have the power to create a better world, but it also means we have a responsibility to use that power wisely.
Exactly. And I think McBeth's interview is a call to action, in a way. It's a challenge for us to think critically, to engage with the world around us, and to work towards a future that we can all be proud of.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation.
It's crazy, right? Like one little detail can just, I don't know, open up a whole new way of thinking about things.
Yeah, it's those little things that often stick with you.
So, we've made it to the end of our deep dive on McBeth's interview. I'm still thinking about all the, like, wild stuff he talked about.
Me too. He really covered a lot of ground.
And for me, you know that thing about the crutch battalions?
Yeah.
That really got to me.
Yeah, that was heavy stuff. It's easy to forget, when you're talking about war and strategy and all that, it's easy to forget about the actual people involved.
Right, like those are real soldiers with real families, and they're being sent back to fight before they've even healed.
It's a reminder that war has a very human cost.
And then there's Trump's interest in Ukraine's resources. I mean, who knew?
Yeah, that was a surprise. It makes you realize that international relations are a lot more complicated than they seem on the surface.
Right, like it's not always about, good versus evil or democracy versus whatever. There are all these other factors at play.
Economic interests, personal ambitions, it gets messy.
And then there's the whole U.S.-side thing. Like, that's still playing out and could have huge consequences. We just don't know yet.
It's a big experiment, and we're all kind of watching to see what happens.
And, McBeth's take on the Gaza situation, that was a real shocker.
Yeah, that was out there. But I guess it's good to, like, hear these different perspectives, even if they sound crazy at first.
Right. Even if it just makes you think, wait, what? That's a good thing.
Yeah, it challenges us to think critically, to question our own assumptions.
And McBeth's analysis of China, that was really insightful too. Like the possibility that they might betray Russia, that's a game changer.
Yeah, it makes you realize that alliances can shift very quickly, depending on what's in each country's best interest.
And the consequences could be devastating, especially if Russia feels backed into a corner.
Right. That's when things could get really dangerous.
So I don't know about you, but I feel like we've learned a lot from this deep dive.
Me too. I feel like I have a better understanding of, the forces that are shaping the world right now.
Yeah, and McBeth, he does such a good job of connecting all the dots. He sees the big picture.
He's like a global puzzle solver.
Exactly. So what do you think are the biggest takeaways from all of this? Like, what should our listeners be thinking about as they, go about their day?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we need to be paying attention to what's happening in the world. Like, even if something seems far away or irrelevant, it could have a huge impact on our lives.
That's true. We're all connected, whether we like it or not.
And I think another important takeaway is that we need to be critical thinkers. We can't just accept everything we hear at face value. We need to question things, to dig deeper, to form our own opinions.
Yeah, and McBeth's interview is a good example of that. He's presenting his analysis, but it's up to us to decide what we believe.
Exactly. We need to be active participants in this whole process, not just passive consumers of information.
And, one thing that really struck me is how much uncertainty there is in the world right now.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It feels like anything could happen.
Like we're at this inflection point, and the decisions that are made in the next few years, they could have a huge impact on the future.
Absolutely. We're living in a time of great change, and it's both exciting and scary.
Yeah, exactly. But that also means that we have an opportunity to shape that future, to make a difference.
Right. Our choices matter, both individually and collectively.
So what do we do with all this information, with all this uncertainty? McBeth doesn't really give us, like, a clear roadmap.
Yeah, he's not handing us the answers on a silver platter, but I think that's part of what makes his analysis so valuable. He's forcing us to think for ourselves, to come up with our own solutions.
And maybe that's the point, right? Like, there are no easy answers. We have to grapple with these complexities to engage in those difficult conversations.
Exactly, and maybe that's how we start to build a better future, by acknowledging the challenges, by being open to different perspectives, and by working together to find solutions.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation.